3 weeks, one text, and a $50 pen that changed everything. 3 weeks. That's how long it took for my entire family to find out who I really was. Not the quiet one. Not the hobbyist. Not the sad little situation they prayed over at Tuesday luncheons. The woman who wrote the book half the country was crying over on their nightstands. My name is Cora Miller. I'm 35 years old. And 3 weeks ago, my parents texted me to skip their 40th anniversary party because I'd embarrassed them in front of real society. So I stayed home, just like they asked. Here's the thing they didn't know. The book everyone was arguing about that month. The one even their fancy guests had on their nightstands. The one with the dedication that read for the ones who were edited out of the photo. I wrote it. They didn't know that. They didn't know a lot of things. The night of the party, my sister called me, her voice shaking. Why did you hide this from the family? Mom and Dad just saw the news. But the part of that night I still can't quite believe came later. Where in the world are you listening from right now? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, where the people written off by their own families finally step into the light, and the receipts do all the talking. If quiet justice is your kind of story, drop a comment and hit subscribe so you don't miss the turn. Now let me take you back 3 weeks. To the text that started all of it. The text. Let me start with the text, because that's really where it starts. 3 weeks before the party, the Miller family group chat lit up for the first time in nearly 2 years. And the message was aimed straight at me. They'd never actually kicked me out of the chat. They just stopped speaking to me in it. Left me sitting there like a name on an old envelope nobody ever mails. Then my mother typed the first words anyone had sent my way in that chat in 2 years. Cora, please don't come to the anniversary. Only high society guests this year. We can't spend the night explaining what you do. Then the thread went quiet again. I screenshotted it before it could scroll away. My family is what Charleston calls good people. 40 years of the right church, the right club, the right last name said the right way at the right parties. My mother has introduced me to her friends as the one who does a little of this and that. I stopped correcting her around the third Thanksgiving. Correcting people who've already decided who you are is just free entertainment for them. And I was tired of being the show. So I set the phone face down and went back to work. Because I had a deadline. And deadlines have never once cared about my mother. What my mother didn't write in that message, the thing she'd been saying for years instead, was the line she handed me when I was 24 and told her I'd sold my first short story. You're a woman with a hobby, Cora. Not a writer. She broke 2 years of silence in that chat for one sentence, and one humiliation. She had no idea it would be the last lie of hers that ever held. What none of them knew. Here's what none of them knew. And I'll just say it plainly. For 6 years, I'd been publishing novels under a name that wasn't mine. C.J. Vesper. My third book, The Quiet Daughter, had been on the bestseller list for 14 months straight. Over 2 million copies. People read it on planes. Thought about it in book clubs. One woman tattooed a line from it on her forearm and sent me a photo through my publisher. Not one person in my family had the faintest idea. I wrote every word of it at a small oak desk with a cheap steel fountain pen I'd bought at 23. The same week, a literary magazine mailed me a $50 check for a story. $50. I framed the check and kept the pen. And I've signed everything with it since. I write best before the house wakes. With a mug of Earl Grey going cold at my elbow. Because the bergamot smell is the only alarm clock my brain actually respects. My agent, Frances Keller, has represented me from the start. She's 66. Terrifying in the best way. And the only person besides my husband who knows both my names. She set up the contracts. She keeps an NDA in a locked drawer with my real signature on it. A pen name isn't hiding. Whatever my mother would later scream. It's a door. And you get to decide who walks through it. My family stood outside that door for years and never once knocked. They were too busy telling everyone the door led nowhere. Last Christmas. You'd think a daughter on the national bestseller list might come up at Christmas dinner. Last December, I drove out to my parents' house in Mount Pleasant. Uninvited as always. Because at 34, I still hadn't learned. My brother Spencer was holding court by the fireplace. Spencer is 38. The golden one. The son who can do no wrong because he's never once done anything hard. He saw me and grinned. Still scribbling your little stories? My father didn't look up from his bourbon. When you've actually published something, we'll talk, he said. The way he'd said it for 10 years. I'd published 3 novels by then. One was being taught in a college course 2 miles from his house. I said nothing. Because that's the trick they never understood about me. I don't argue. I just remember. And memory keeps better records than any fight. Then my mother walked a guest past the side table. And I saw it. A hardback copy of The Quiet Daughter. Displayed face out like a trophy. Oh, everyone's reading this one, she told the woman, touching the cover. So moving. That poor girl in it. My mother was showing off my book to impress a stranger. And she had no idea whose blood was on the pages. I drank 1 glass of wine and left before dinner. On the drive home, I laughed until laughing stopped being the right word for it. My mother displayed my book like a prize on her mantle. She just couldn't recognize the family inside it. Because she had never once managed to recognize me. Where she came from. To be fair to my mother, and I do try, on the good days, she came up hard. Lorraine grew up in a mill town 2 hours inland. In a house with a tin roof and a father who drank the rent money before it could become rent. She married my dad at 19, and clawed her way into Charleston the way you'd climb a wet rope. Hand over raw hand. The club membership. The Harbor View house. The children who turned out right. None of that was vanity to her. It was proof she'd gotten out. A son people called successful. A son-in-law from a good firm. Things you can say at a Tuesday luncheon, and watch the table nod. And then there was me. She writes, was not an answer my mother could give those women. To her, it sounded like an apology. Like admitting the rope had slipped a few inches while no one was looking. My father was simpler about it. He ran a regional bank branch for 30 years, and believed a real job was one that issued a W-2 and a pension. Writing to him was playing pretend with the lights on. So I understood them both. I understood exactly why a daughter who made her living from sentences felt to them like a hairline crack in a wall they'd spent 40 years plastering smooth. Understanding it never once made the plaster hurt less. It just meant I finally stopped expecting the wall to apologize to me. The call from Whitney. By the time that text arrived, I'd made a hard peace with the silence. What I hadn't planned for was the silence running out of time. A week before the party, my sister Whitney called. Whitney is 33 and allergic to conflict the way some people are allergic to bees. Same risk of swelling up and going quiet. Cora? Hey, she said in the bright voice she uses right before she does something cowardly. I tried to get them to invite you. I really did. Did you? You know how Mom gets about appearances. And honestly, you'd hate it anyway. All those society people. The small talk. The whole stiff thing. The whole stiff thing, I repeated. You'd just feel out of place. She finished soft, like she was doing me a kindness. There it was. Not we want you there. Not this is wrong and I'll fight it. Just a little knife wrapped carefully in concern for my comfort. Then she did what Whitney always does, which is fish. So, what have you been up to? Anything new with you? She wanted a scrap. Something small to carry back to the others. I gave her nothing at all. Same as always. A little of this and that. I could actually hear her shoulders drop. The quiet sister still quiet. Still safe to leave outside in the cold. Before she hung up, she added, "Don't make it a thing, okay? For Mom's sake." I told her I wouldn't make it a thing. And that part was completely true. I had never once made it a thing. I just kept building. In the dark room they'd assured everyone was empty. And Whitney, sweet frightened Whitney, had just helped them lock a door she would one day be standing on the wrong side of. Crying. My father's verdict. 3 days later, my father called. Which he does roughly twice a year. Both times to deliver a verdict. Cora. Clipped, like a man closing a teller window at 5 sharp. The guest list is final. I want that understood. It's understood, Dad. There will be important people there. I won't have the evening turned into a discussion about your situation. My situation? I almost asked which one. Since I have a mortgage, a marriage, and as of that week, a film offer on the table. So he'd really have to narrow it down. I didn't. Then he said the thing that changed the temperature of the entire month. Your mother's worked hard to get a certain woman to fly down. Adele Hartwell runs some big literary foundation up north. Diane's been writing them checks for years, and now she wants a seat on the board to show for it. So everyone is to be on their best behavior. I had to sit down on the edge of my bed. Adele Hartwell, the Hartwell Foundation for American Letters. The woman who'd spent the past year publicly hunting for the author of The Quiet Daughter, who had called my book in print the most honest thing I have ever read about being invisible inside your own family. My parents were rolling out the carpet for the one person on earth who openly worshipped my work, and they'd booked the night to finally bury me beside it. Best behavior, I said. Got it. I hung up before he could hear me breathe. My father wanted to impress Adele Hartwell so badly he could taste it. He had no idea he'd already mailed her my whole soul. 2 million copies of it. Gift wrapped. The Aunt Patricia text. 2 days before the party, a text came in from Aunt Patricia, my father's sister. A woman I see once a year, and like about twice that much. Sweetheart, your mom told me about the party. Are you doing okay? She mentioned you've been struggling mentally. I mean lately. I just want you to know I'm praying for you. I read it twice to be sure. So that was the story now. Not Cora wasn't invited. Cora was unwell. Cora was fragile. Cora was a sad little situation the family managed quietly with grace and a lot of praying. I opened the family group chat, the one they'd muted me into oblivion in, and scrolled. 40-some messages about the party. Ziting chats. Whether the band knew their song. A close-up of my mother's gown. Not my name anywhere. Not once. Except where my mother had written weeks earlier. Let's keep it simple. Cora, people worry. Bless them. Bless them. I found the rest on Facebook, where my mother does her real damage. A friend of hers had posted, "Thinking of your family during this hard season, Diane." Under it, my mother had typed, "Some children just struggle. We do what we can." And she'd liked the comment that called me unstable. A hobby was no longer enough for her. Now I had to be a tragedy, because an unstable daughter explains an empty chair so much more sympathetically than an uninvited one. Lies need feeding to stay alive. My mother had been feeding this one for years. She just never once checked whether the thing she kept in the cage was still small. The other half of my life. Now let me take you to the other half of my life. The half they decided didn't exist. The morning after Aunt Patricia's text, I drove downtown to a glass tower and rode up to Frances Keller's office. Frances doesn't do small talk. She slid a printout across the desk before I'd even sat down. The Quiet Daughter had made the short list for the Hartwell Prize. Adele Hartwell's own award. The biggest in American fiction that year. And Frances said, tapping a second page with one ringed finger, "Calloway wants the film." The director, Cora. A serious written offer. Not a cocktail party handshake. I read the number twice to make my eyes behave. Then she leaned back and looked at me the way she looks at a clause she doesn't trust. You should know something before you celebrate. If you win that prize and the film gets announced together, the press will dig. They've done it to anonymous writers before. Real journalists. Forensic readers. Somebody's cousin who knows somebody at the bank. Your name could come out. The real one. I sat with that for a long moment. 6 years of a door I controlled. And now a steady wind was leaning on the frame. How long do I have to decide? I asked. About whether to confirm it myself or let a stranger do it for me. Frances shrugged her expensive shoulders. Days. Not weeks. Then she said the line I now keep written on a card by my desk. You wrote the truth, Cora. The truth has a way of knocking on its own door. I drove home that afternoon wondering whose hand it would knock with. Frances calls back. Frances called back that night with the part that made me laugh out loud alone in my kitchen. You'll appreciate this one, she said. Adele Hartwell has been telling everyone in New York she'll find Vesper if it's the last thing she does. She put your book at the top of the prize list herself over a lot of objections. A pause. Because even Frances enjoys a clean twist. She's flying down to Charleston this weekend. Some anniversary party a donor talked her into. I set my mug down very carefully on the counter. A donor named Miller by any chance? Silence on the line. Then how on earth did you know that? I told her it was my parents' party. The exact party I'd been forbidden to attend in case I embarrassed them in front of important people. Frances went quiet. And Frances is never quiet. So let me make sure I have this right, she said slowly. The woman your mother is auditioning for, begging for a board seat from, has spent a year searching for you. Yes. And your mother personally invited her into a room you are banned from. Yes. Frances started to laugh. A dry rasp like an old drawer pulling open. Cora, she said. I have sold over 400 books in this career. I have never in my life seen a setup arrange itself this neatly. I hadn't either. And that scared me more than it pleased me. I told her I needed the night to think. What I didn't tell her was that I'd already started. Not about whether the truth would come out, but about whether I'd be standing in the room when it did. What I actually did. Here's the part of the story people expect. The part where I rub my hands together and plot my grand entrance. That's not what happened. And I want to be honest with you about that. I sat at my desk that night with my husband, Nathan. He teaches 10th grade history, and has loved me through 6 years of rejection letters and 2 years of a fame he's promised never to bring up in the teacher's lounge. You don't owe them a performance, he said quietly. You don't even owe them a warning. He was right. I wasn't going to call my mother and threaten her with my own success like a woman in a soap opera. I wasn't going to beg for a chair either. Begging for a seat from people who cropped you out of every photo just helps them feel powerful. And I was done volunteering for that. So I made a pot of Earl Grey instead. The bergamot rising sharp and clean through the kitchen. The smell I used to find my own bottom. The solid floor underneath the floor. And I made one real decision while I drank it. My daughter Leia is 6. My parents have met her exactly twice. I decided then that whatever happened that weekend, Leia would never spend a single Christmas of her life auditioning for a love that had already been promised to someone else. I'd ended that pattern before it could ever reach her. The quiet sister was finished being quiet about that, at least. So I let the truth keep its own schedule. I just hadn't decided yet whether I'd open the door for it, or be the one already standing inside when it swung wide. Meanwhile, Spencer was being Spencer. Meanwhile, my brother was busy being Spencer. He runs what he proudly calls a lifestyle brand, which is mostly photos of himself in flattering light holding things he wants you to want. That week he posted a story to his 30,000 followers. Him at a wooden desk he does not write at. Captioned, "Big literary project in the works. Can't say more yet." With the little eyes emoji. My phone nearly cracked from how hard I rolled my eyes. Spencer had never finished a book in his life, never mind written one. But he'd been telling people for months that he had connections in publishing, that something major was coming soon. Watch this space. The truth, which Whitney let slip to me once and instantly regretted, was uglier and far more ordinary. Spencer was underwater. The brand ran entirely on credit and good lighting. He'd invited a sponsor to the anniversary party, an actual brand representative flying in, because he needed to close a deal that weekend just to keep the lights on at his condo. So picture the room my mother was so carefully building. Adele Hartwell hunting an author. A sponsor deciding whether Spencer was worth the check. My parents arranging their successful children on the mantle like trophies under good track lighting. And the one daughter who could level the whole display sitting 25 minutes away with a pot of tea and an unsigned film contract. Best behavior, my father had ordered. Every last one of them was about to be on their truest behavior instead. And the strangest part is that almost none of it would be my doing. All I had to do was let people keep being exactly who they already were. Saturday morning, the day of the party. I drove back to the glass tower. Frances had asked me to come in person, which she only ever does when ink is about to be involved. The city was already warm by 9. The harbor flat and bright as a coin. Up in her office, she had 2 things waiting for me. First, the news. The Hartwell Prize would be announced that evening by live stream at 8:15. 8:15. The party started at 6. I did the arithmetic without meaning to. The way you flinch at a loud sound. Second, on the desk squared inside a crisp folder, sat the film option agreement from Callaway's company. $1.2 million to option The Quiet Daughter, with my legal name printed on the signature line, and a separate NDA built to keep CJ Vesper sealed for exactly as long as I wanted her sealed. Frances tapped the folder twice. I've read every line twice. It's clean. Cleaner than clean. She held out one of her heavy fancy pens, and I waved it gently away, because I'd brought my own, the way I always do. All it needs, she said, watching me dig into my bag, is your real name. I pulled out the steel pen I'd bought at 23, the $50 pen my mother had once picked up off a kitchen table, turned over and called a toy. I uncapped it, and for one long moment, I just looked at the empty line where Cora Miller was supposed to go. The name my family had spent years insisting led absolutely nowhere. About to be worth more than my father had earned in a decade of closing the branch at 5. I signed it. Cora. In steel blue ink on the line that turned $1 million deal into a real one. The pen scratched the way it always has. A little dry on the downstrokes. And I thought about the framed $50 check at home, and the woman who'd held this exact pen across a kitchen table, and called it a toy in front of company. My mother called this thing a toy. I told Frances. I just bought a house with it. Frances didn't laugh. She watched me cap the pen and said, Cora, do you understand what you're holding now? I did. Not the money. The money was almost beside the point by then. What I held was proof. A contract with my legal name on it. A copyright registered to Cora Miller 6 years earlier with a date a federal office had stamped and kept. A prize hours from being announced, judged by the very woman my parents were debasing themselves to impress. For years, my family had built their version of me out of nothing at all. A hobby. A struggle. A sad little situation. And I'd let them. Because correcting it cost more than I had to spend. But you cannot argue with a signature. You cannot gossip your way past a registered copyright, a filed contract, or a live-streamed prize with witnesses. They had used whispers year after year in the right rooms. I had used ink and dates and other people's eyes. And ink does not care what the club thinks of you. I slid the folder into my bag, and the pen back into my coat pocket where I could feel its weight against my ribs. Frances walked me to the elevator. Adele Hartwell is going to that party tonight, she said. Whatever you decide it before 8:15. The doors closed on her face. I rode that mirrored elevator down 40 floors holding a contract worth more than the house I grew up in. 3 weeks after a text told me I would embarrass them. I had until 8:15 to choose. Let the truth knock. Or walk it through the door myself. What The Quiet Daughter is actually about. I should tell you what The Quiet Daughter is actually about. Because it matters enormously for what came next. It's a novel. Invented people. Invented town. But I built every brick of it out of my own 35 years. There's a mother in it who measures love strictly in things you can mention at lunch. A favored brother who shines because no one has ever once asked him to do anything difficult. A father who quietly confuses a steady paycheck with a soul. And a daughter who slowly stops explaining herself and starts disappearing on purpose. Until disappearing becomes the only real power she has left in the house. Critics called the book unbearably honest. Adele Hartwell in her review called the mother one of the great quiet monsters of recent American fiction. 2 million people read that woman on the page and shuddered. And not one of them knew she answered to the name Lorraine at a Harbor View house in Mount Pleasant. My family had been reading about themselves for 14 straight months. My mother displayed the book. My aunt mailed copies to friends with little notes. Strangers wept on airplanes over a childhood that was give or take a name mine. And the people who had lived it from the other side never recognized a single room. That is the part that still genuinely amazes me. You can write the truth in letters 6 feet tall. Put it on every nightstand in America. And the people it's about will walk straight past it. Because recognizing it would mean recognizing you first. I had handed them a mirror 2 million times over. They just kept stopping to admire the frame. Whitney at 5 o'clock. At 5 o'clock. 1 hour before the party. Whitney called again. This time, the bright voice was gone entirely. Hey, she said. Are you doing okay tonight? I'm fine, Whitney. Okay, good. It's just she stopped. I waited. Because my sister has a tell. When she's circling something true, she breathes like she's about to dive off a high board. Never mind, she said. Forget I called. But she didn't hang up. And that was new. Cora, can I ask you something kind of weird? Sure. That book everyone's reading. The Quiet Daughter. My pulse turned over once. Slow and complete. What about it? Another diving breath. I read it last summer. And there's this scene. The birthday one. Where the girl waits alone in the kitchen for people who never come down. She laughed far too high. It felt like our kitchen. The yellow clock over the stove. I don't know. It's stupid. Forget it. I kept my voice as flat and steady as a person carrying a full cup across a moving train. Lots of kitchens have yellow clocks, Whitney. Yeah, she said after a second too long. Yeah, you're right. She'd been standing right at the edge of it for a year. Close enough to feel the heat on her face. Too frightened to turn and look at the fire. I should go get ready, she said. Wish me luck tonight. Okay. She hung up before I could decide whether to finally tell her. The party started in 1 hour. The whole world found out in 3. And my sister, bless her careful heart, had very nearly figured it out first. And chosen one more time to look away. A quick pause. Let me pause for just 1 second. If your family ever decided who you were and never once bothered to check the facts, and you built your real life quietly anyway, I see you. Comment built it quiet so I know you're out there with me. And if you want to watch a rooftop full of strangers find out exactly who wrote the book they'd been crying over all year, stay right here. We're almost to 6 o'clock. The rooftop at 6 o'clock. I wasn't there at 6 o'clock. So let me build the room for you the way I later learned it. From Francis. From Whitney. And from one guest who afterward could not stop talking about it to anyone who'd hold still. The party was on the rooftop of the Rutledge, a glass and limestone hotel downtown with a clean view of the harbor, and a bar that charges $14 for water with a backstory. 120 guests in black tie, a jazz trio in the corner, silver trays of oysters, and a champagne my mother had chosen mostly because the name sounded like money when you said it. She wore a column of midnight silk, and stood at the top of the stairs greeting people like a woman who had finally been let into the right room, and fully intended to die in it. My father shook hands and called everyone my friend. Spencer worked the floor with his sponsor at his elbow, laughing a half-second too loud at his own setups. 40 years of marriage. And the party wasn't really about the marriage at all. It was about being seen surviving it beautifully. And somewhere in that glittering crowd, holding a glass she barely touched, stood a 60-year-old woman in an unremarkable gray dress that almost certainly cost more than the entire bar. Nobody knew it yet, but she was the only person on that whole roof who'd come hunting for the truth. My mother had spent a solid month curating the perfect audience for her triumph. She'd simply had the wrong idea, start to finish, about what they had actually come to see. Adele arrives. Adele Hartwell arrived at 7 o'clock. And my mother descended on her like weather rolling off the water. Mrs. Hartwell, what an honor. I've followed the Foundation's work for years. Adele, who has heard that exact sentence from 1,000 strangers at 1,000 parties, smiled the careful smile of a woman conserving her energy for later. Thank you for having me. I'll confess I had an ulterior motive in coming this far south. My mother lit up at once, sensing an opening, a connection. A board seat almost in her hand. I'm hunting an author, Adele said. C.J. Vesper. Who wrote The Quiet Daughter. I'm convinced the writer is a Carolina native. The book knows these places far too well to be faking them. I keep hoping I'll simply bump into them in a room like this one. My mother had read the book. Displayed it. Recommended it warmly. Such a moving story, she offered. That poor daughter. Adele's gaze drifted out over the crowd. It's the mother I genuinely can't shake. One of the great quiet monsters. I think you almost understand her. And that's precisely what makes her unbearable. My mother nodded along, agreeing warmly that the monster was indeed unbearable. Having no earthly idea she was standing there reviewing her own performance to its author's biggest fan. Then Adele asked lightly, as if making conversation. Do you have any children who write? These talents do tend to run in families. And my mother, sensing her moment had arrived, smiled wide and said, "My son, actually. Spencer. He's working on something quite big in publishing right now." Across the roof, Spencer beamed for his sponsor, never knowing his mother had just handed his entire bluff to the one woman alive who could call it. 8:15. At 8:15 exactly, the Hartwell Prize live stream went out. And the internet did what the internet does. The announcement itself was simple enough. The prize, the largest in American letters, went to The Quiet Daughter by C.J. Vesper. The foundation never said more than the pen name. They didn't have to. The legal name came from somewhere else. Reporters had spent the week pulling at the loose threads a fresh film deal had left lying around, until one of them ran the book's copyright and found it registered 6 years ago to a real woman at a real address. The pseudonym came apart into 3 ordinary words. Cora Miller of Charleston, South Carolina. On a rooftop in Charleston, South Carolina, 120 phones lit up at very nearly the same instant. The jazz trio kept gamely playing for a few seconds into a silence that was already spreading across the floor like spilled wine. A culture reporter who'd wrangled an invitation through a friend gasped out loud and grabbed her colleague's arm hard. "It's her. They found Vesper. And she's local. She's from right here." Then her eyes snagged on the cocktail napkins. The step and repeat banner. The gold lettering. Miller. 40 years. The reporter's face did something complicated and slow. "Wait," she said, loud enough now to carry across the hush. "Miller. Aren't these people the hosts?" The name moved through the crowd the way a current finds the lowest channel and rushes it. People who'd been admiring the harbor turned as a body to look at my mother. People who had just that month wept over a fictional family began quietly to do the math on a real one standing right in front of them. Adele Hartwell stood very still in her gray dress and set her glass down on a passing tray. Slowly, deliberately. The way you set something down when you've just understood the whole shape of it. My mother had spent the entire night selling the wrong child to the one perfect room. And the room had just bought the truth wholesale with every single light on. The call. My phone rang at 8:17. "Whitney." I was sitting at my own kitchen table with cold tea and a live stream of my own name scrolling past. I answered. "Why did you hide this from the family?" Her voice was shaking exactly the way the title of this whole story promised you it would. "Mom and Dad just saw the news. Everyone's looking at them. Cora, the whole party stopped. Why didn't you tell us?" Behind her, I could hear all of it. 100 low murmurs. And rising over them, my mother's voice climbing into a register I knew by heart. "There must be another. It's a common name." "It isn't. Someone's gotten confused. That's all." "I didn't hide anything, Whitney," I said. "Quiet even then. I published 3 books under a pen name. That's allowed. You all just never once asked the quiet one a single real question in 15 years. Silence on her end. The bad kind. The kind that means a person has stopped breathing to think. Then much smaller. The kitchen scene. The yellow clock. It was us. It was always us, wasn't it? Yes. Oh God. She started to cry. I knew. Some part of me knew. And You looked away, I said. You've been looking away your whole life, Whitney. It's okay. You learned it from professionals. On the rooftop, my father had reportedly gone the exact gray of the limestone, and Adele Hartwell was already walking, unhurried, toward the center of the room. I didn't see any of it from my kitchen, but I felt the floor of my whole life tilt for the first time in years toward something close to level. I have to go, Whitney whispered. Mom's Cora, she's losing it. I know, I said. Let her. What happened on the roof? Here's what was happening on the roof while I sat in my kitchen. Stitched together later from too many eager tellings. A guest, a retired judge's wife, exactly the kind of woman my mother had spent 40 years courting, pulled up an old interview on her phone and read it aloud to the cluster around her. In it, C.J. Vesper, still masked and anonymous at the time, had been asked where the book had come from. The answer, in my own words. I grew up being told I had a hobby, not a voice. So I built a voice nobody could mute. It just took me a long while to stop asking their permission first. A hobby, not a voice. The judge's wife looked up slowly from the little screen. And right at my mother. Other guests were on the same page now. Some of them literally, Somebody had a copy of the book open to the dedication, which reads in full, "For the ones who were edited out of the photo." Edited out of the photo. People who knew my family well enough to know there had always been a second daughter. A quiet one. Never quite explained. Were connecting lines that had been sitting in plain sight on every bestseller table for 14 months. Adele Hartwell reached the dead center of the roof. The trio, reading the temperature at last, let the song fall away. My mother stood frozen with a champagne flute she'd entirely forgotten she was holding. And into that ringing silence, the great quiet monster of recent American fiction waited to hear what came next. Surrounded for the very first time in her life by a room that had read her cover to cover. Right before the part you came for. Quick second. Right before the part you came here for. None of what's about to happen on that roof is me yelling. It's a contract. A prize. And a room full of witnesses doing what whispers never once could. If you've ever wished the truth could just win without you having to scream it across a room, type "Let the truth talk." Then stay exactly where you are. This is the moment I finally open the door. The text from Francis. Francis texted me at 8:20. Adele is holding the room. It's yours if you want it. Or stay home and let the press write it for you. Your call. But decide now, Cora. I looked at my daughter's crayon drawing taped crooked on the fridge. I looked at Nathan, who said only, "Whatever you decide, I'll drive." And then I made tea. I know exactly how that sounds. But I poured the last of the Earl Grey into a steel thermos. And the bergamot came up sharp and bright. And this time, it didn't settle me down the way it had for 6 years of mornings. This time, it pointed me somewhere. That smell had always been the solid floor I stood on to write the truth down quietly. Now for the first time, it was a door instead. I wasn't driving to that roof to make a scene. I'd spent 35 years carefully not making scenes. And I was not about to hand my mother the gift of one now in front of all her people. I was going because 120 strangers were standing inside a story I wrote with my own hand. And I had earned, fairly and completely, the right to stand in it, too. "Get your keys," I told Nathan. I capped the thermos, slid the steel pen into my coat pocket where I could feel its small weight against me, and walked out to the car. 25 minutes downtown. The harbor on my left the whole way, lit up gold and waiting, like it had known I was coming. I wasn't on the list, but I'd already written my way into every conversation in that room. All that was left to do now was open the door. The elevator. The Rutledge elevator opened onto the roof at 8:50. Warm harbor air. A wall of lights. And 120 people in formal wear, all turned somehow the wrong way toward my mother, and away from the view they'd paid for. I stepped out. And a woman near the bar saw me first. Her hand flew to her mouth. "That's her," she said. "That's Vesper." The name passed through the crowd a second time that night. Quieter now. Like a tide going back out over sand. People stepped aside to make a path I hadn't asked anyone for. I'm 5'4" in flats. And I'd worn flats. I hadn't dressed to win anything that evening. I wore a plain navy dress. The steel pen in my pocket. And the palm I'd been building brick by brick since I was 24 years old. My mother saw me. The champagne flute in her hand tipped. A thin line of it ran down her wrist. And she never once noticed. My father had aged a full decade in 2 hours. Spencer's mouth hung open. His sponsor was very quietly and very quickly putting on his coat by the stairs. And across the room, Adele Hartwell smiled. The first genuine smile anyone described to me from that whole night. And gave me the smallest nod. As if to say, "The floor is yours. Take all the time you need." I didn't rush it. I'd learned patience from people who never once offered me any. I walked to the center of the roof. Past the oysters and the silent trio. And 40 years of my mother's careful arithmetic. And I stopped a few feet from my parents. Close enough to be heard clearly. Calm enough to be believed completely. "Sorry I'm late," I said. I wasn't on the list. The confrontation. My mother found her voice. And it came out all wrong. Too loud. Cracking at the very top. "You did this. You planned this to humiliate us in front of, after everything we—" "I didn't plan anything, Mom. A prize committee picked a night. A studio filed a contract. I just answered the phone when my own name finally rang." Don't you dare make me out to be the... She looked around at the watching faces and dropped it. Far too late. You've always wanted attention. Always. The dramatic one. That landed strange in a dead silent room. Since I was the only person standing on it not raising my voice. You called me the dramatic one, I said. Quiet. Even for 35 years. You called me a lot of things. Do you remember what you told me when I sold my first story? I was 24. You said, "You're a woman with a hobby, Cora. Not a writer." I let it sit there in the air. 120 people had just spent a year reading a book about a mother who says things exactly like that. I put that line on page 40, I said quietly. Reviewers thought I invented it. They wrote that no real mother would ever actually say such a thing to her own child. My father stepped in, gray and stiff as a post. This isn't the time or the place, Cora. You're right, Dad. The time was 24. You looked me in the eye and said, when you've actually published something, we'll talk. I've published 3. One is taught 2 miles from your front door. I opened one hand toward the rooftop. The banner. The prize still glowing on a dozen phones. Here I am. Let's talk. He had nothing at all. My mother began to cry. The performing kind. The kind that had always worked before. Dabbing at eyes that scanned the crowd desperately for a single ally. There wasn't one left. The whisper had finally met the witnesses. And the witnesses had read the book. Adele speaks. Adele Hartwell chose that exact moment to speak. And a room that had been holding its breath turned toward her like houseplants toward a window. Forgive me, she said in a voice that didn't need any volume to fill the roof. I came here tonight hoping to meet a writer. I did not expect to meet the family that spent her entire childhood trying to erase her. She turned to face me. Miss Miller, the Hartwell Prize is the highest honor my foundation gives. As of tonight, it's yours. For a novel that taught 2 million readers what it costs to go unseen by the very people who should have seen you first. Polite applause started somewhere over near the bar, and then grew into the real kind. The kind that catches people by surprise and pulls them in. Then Adele looked at my mother, and the warmth went out of her face like a door swinging shut. Mrs. Miller, I understand you've been quite interested in a seat on our board, and you've been generous to the foundation for years now. My mother straightened, some ancient, stubborn hope flickering up even now. I'll be honest with you, Adele said. Your checks bought you real consideration. I came south half intending to offer you that seat. She paused. I'll be extending the invitation instead to the writer, whose work my foundation exists to protect. Some things you fund. Some things you earn. To me. Simply. If you'll have it. $1.2 million for the film. The biggest prize in the country. And the board seat my mother had built an entire poison evening around winning. Handed in front of every important person she owned to the daughter she'd called a hobby. I didn't gloat. I didn't have to. The numbers were doing all of it for me. The way ink always does the work in the end. And my mother was learning in real time the single lesson she had refused her whole life. You cannot whisper your way out of a signature. 2 more things. 2 more things happened in the next 5 minutes. And I only stayed for one of them. Spencer's sponsor. The man he'd flown in to impress. The deal that was quietly keeping his lights on. Had seen and heard plenty. He'd just watched an entire family present a big literary project in the works that turned out to belong to the sister they'd hidden away like a coat in a back closet. He shook Spencer's hand the way you shake a hand you have already decided never to take again, said something short and low, and left before the elevator had even finished warming. Spencer stood there holding a glass of champagne he couldn't afford in a suit he'd financed, watching his entire brand walk itself down to the parking garage. And Whitney, my Whitney, crossed the roof toward me with her mascara wrecked. Not performing for once in her life. Just genuinely undone. I knew, she said. The kitchen. The clock. I knew. And I said absolutely nothing because saying something meant looking at all of it. And I was a coward. Cora, I was such a coward. I looked at my little sister, who'd helped lock the door years ago, and was now standing on the wrong side of it. Crying exactly as I'd quietly feared she someday would. I believe you're sorry, I said. And I did believe it. That's not the same thing as it being fixed. She nodded fast, like she'd braced for far worse and was simply grateful it hadn't come. It was, I think, the most honest sentence anyone in my family had spoken to me in 20 years. It wasn't a reconciliation. It was a thin crack of light under a door I might someday decide to open. Someday. Not tonight. The signature. I didn't stay to watch my mother gather up the pieces. I turned to my parents one last time in front of all the witnesses, and kept my voice perfectly level. I'm not here to ruin your anniversary. 40 years is 40 years. And I mean that. But the book all your important people spent the night praising? I wrote it. The prize they just announced is mine. And now I'm going home to my husband and my daughter, who will never once in her life be made to feel like somebody's hobby. A guest near me was holding a copy of The Quiet Daughter, because half the city seemed to own one, and she held it out shy and asked if I would sign it. So I took out the steel pen, the $50 pen my mother had once turned over in her fingers, and called a toy. And for the first time in my entire life, I signed my own name in public in full, where every last person could see it. Cora Miller. Not Vesper. Cora. The girl they cropped out of every photo, writing herself back into the frame in steel blue ink in front of the whole room. I kept the pen. Turns out the hobby paid for itself, I said. To no one and to everyone at once. And I walked toward the elevator, past 40 years of careful arithmetic that had finally, publicly failed to add up to anything. Nathan was waiting in the car with the harbor lights strung out behind him. I got in. I didn't look back at the roof even once. I'd already written everything I would ever need to say about it. 2 million copies of it. And the whole city was holding the receipt. The fallout. The fallout was quiet and total, which is the best kind there is. Within a week, Charleston society had rearranged itself around my parents. The way a body quietly walls off a splinter. The board seat went to me. I took it. And it turns out I'm good at it. The film starts shooting next spring. Spencer's brand folded by summer. The lost sponsor was the third domino to fall, not the first. He sells real estate now, which honestly suits him better than the lighting ever did. My mother told everyone the whole thing had been a simple misunderstanding. That of course she'd always supported my writing. And a few people even pretended to believe her. Because that is precisely what those rooms are for. My father hasn't called. Knowing him, he never will. Because admitting he was wrong would cost him the only thing he has ever truly banked. Which is being right. And the Miller family group chat. The one they'd left me sitting silent inside for 2 years. And used for a single sentence telling me to stay away. I finally left it myself. No annoncement. No speech. I just tapped the small gray words leave group and watched my own name disappear from a place where it had never really been allowed to live anyway. For the first time, I was the one editing myself out of the photo on purpose. With my own hand. It felt like setting down something I'd been carrying so long that I genuinely stopped noticing the weight of it. Until the moment it was gone and my arms came back up light. Coffee with Whitney. Whitney asked to see me a month later. We met for coffee. 1 cup. No parents. No party. No audience to play to. She apologized again properly this time. And meant it all the way down. I told her the door wasn't locked. But it wasn't open either. It was just a door now. With a handle on my side. And that would have to be enough for a long while. She cried a little, and said that was fair. It was the first genuinely fair thing anyone in my family had ever offered me. So I took it carefully. The way you take something that might still break. I'm not punishing anyone. I'm just finally done auditioning for a part that was always, from the beginning, mine. Some relationships you repair slowly with both people working. And some you simply stop bleeding into. Learning to tell the difference between the two without guilt turned out to be the whole job. I spent 35 years waiting for my family to finally see me. And it turned out the answer was never to argue louder or beg harder. But to write the truth down plainly. Sign my own real name to it. And let the quiet do the rest of the work. That's my story. 1 text telling me not to come. 1 book that said everything I never could out loud. And a $50 pen my mother once called a toy. If someone in your life ever shrank you down to a hobby, take this as your sign to keep building anyway. Quietly. With your real name. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment. hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.